The 911 call came at 12:19 p.m. On the line, the dispatcher didn't hear a clear voice, just faint screams and indistinguishable noises. Then, in an instant, dead silence. It was treated initially as an accidental dial, and no help was sent. For 48 agonizing minutes, a young woman fought for her life, her desperate cries vanishing into a void that offered no answer. An hour later, her fiancé Jordan came to their apartment in Madison and found the front door open, the lock splintered and broken by some sort of violent force. Inside, a scene of unspeakable horror awaited him. Brittany lay unresponsive in a pool of blood, already cold to the touch. Police arrived within minutes to confirm Jordan's worst fears. Brittany, a bright and energetic 21-year-old college student with dreams of medical school, had been brutally murdered, stabbed, beaten, and strangled. The investigation to follow soon became a puzzle. No evidence of theft was found, and her computers and personal things weren't touched. Was this a targeted attack, or some random act of savage violence? Adding to the chilling mystery was the 911 call from Brittany's own phone an hour earlier, a desperate plea that wasn't answered. And the question of why no one responded to her cries would weigh over the investigation like a shadow, haunting every step taken in pursuit of justice. And before I deep dive into this story, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you don't miss out on the latest cases. Back in 2008, 21-year-old Brittany Zimmerman was living her dream life as a college student, but it hadn't always been that way. She grew up in a small Wisconsin town. Typical, but with big ambitions for a girl of her age. By the time she graduated from high school in 2005, with the help of her guidance counselor, she knew precisely what lay ahead in her promising future, as one where she would make a difference and be able to help people. Her ultimate goal was to become a doctor. She knew the road ahead would be long, grueling, and filled with challenges, but she was ready for it. She had a particular interest in diseases, dreaming one day of working at the Centers for Disease Control in Hawaii. But getting into a top college and eventually a medical school would require more than just careful planning. During high school, Brittany was engaged in numerous activities that would make her stand out. She was a member of the Spanish Club, the school band, and the National Honor Society. In addition to her involvement in those extracurricular activities, she volunteered at the American Cancer Society Hope Lodge, recognizing that real success was the result of hard work and dedication. After graduation, Brittany headed to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a little more than 2 hours from Marshfield. She majored in immunology and microbiology, and her intellect became quickly apparent. She made the dean's list during her first 2 semesters. College brought its share of unpredictability, but there was one constant in Brittany's life: her boyfriend, Jordan Genig. Brittany and Jordan had known each other since almost their whole lives, officially dating since high school. The relationship was serious enough that Jordan eventually transferred to the same college, with the two moving into an apartment together in downtown Madison. It was the perfect setup for young college students, close enough for a quick commute, yet private and independent. Brittany always thought about safety. She kept doors and windows locked at all times and tried to be very aware of her surroundings. The area they lived in was not particularly dangerous. However, it did have some problems with homelessness and some areas of crime. Both Brittany and Jordan were very cautious, always locking their cars, the front door, and everything else they could. Locking all her windows, securing the doors. These were the things any city dweller would refer to as standard precaution, and yet caution never overshadowed her love for life. Saying she lived life to the fullest would barely scratch the surface of what Brittany's days consisted of: balancing a grueling major, an active social life, a job, and even wedding planning with Jordan. Yes, they had started dreaming of a wedding in Hawaii, symbolic of the life that they wished to build. Few college students have the luxury of attending school and not working. Brittany's motivations for working necessity, ambition, or both are not entirely clear. Undeniably, she did have a campus job in the registrar's office, and it didn't take her long to distinguish herself. She was not in it just for the paycheck. She always did more than what her job called for with energy and concentration. Her job entailed the mundane tasks of working with student records, scanning, organizing, and filing. Where some would find this boring, Brittany attacked it with a grin. She even created an entire new system for organizing the documents more efficiently, a very forward-thinking initiative that her supervisors greatly appreciated. Many who knew her would describe Brittany as one of those people who was relentlessly positive, who viewed life through a glass-half-full perspective. When Brittany learned just how grueling the pre-med track would be, she didn't falter. Confident that she could do anything if she put her mind to it, she faced the challenge head-on. She also knew she wanted a life with Jordan, marriage, kids, a shared future. She knew that this rigorous education would simply create some complications for those plans in the short term. Yet she never allowed fear or negativity to take hold. Instead, she trusted in herself and her determination to make her dreams a reality. By spring 2008, Brittany recognized that her coursework demanded her full attention and decided to take the semester off from work. For someone known for her tireless work ethic, this was no small decision. In the office, she was sorely missed. But her academic progress was of the essence. She plunged into academics, attending every class and keeping up with her rigorous schedule. As April came around, the end of the semester was within view. Students, Brittany and Jordan included, were hurriedly working on last-minute assignments and studying for final exams. On April 2nd, 2008, Brittany attended her morning class, which let out at 11:00 a.m. She hung around after the class with a friend to discuss final papers and exams with the professor. Once outside, Jordan saw her from a balcony and called her cell to talk. Following the conversation, Brittany started to walk back to their apartment to begin studying. At 11:08 a.m., she attempted to call her mother but got no response. Once she returned home, she turned on her computer to start studying, but only between approximately 12:00 and 12:18 p.m. The fact that she worked for such a limited period indicates a disruption or something that interfered with her intention. She had absolutely no idea how bad it was about to get. A call was then placed to 911 at 12:19 p.m. No intelligible voice was on the other end of the call, only muffled screams could be heard, followed by incoherent sounds, then dead silence. The call went dead. The dispatcher, perhaps assuming it was an accidental or even a prank call, took no further action. And just 1 hour later, just after 1 p.m., another call came in. But this time, a voice was clearly heard. It was Jordan, frantic and overwhelmed, recounting a scene that seemed pulled straight from a nightmare. Earlier in the morning, Jordan had been on campus, attending his classes. His last class ended at 12:55 p.m., and he wanted to hurry home in order to attend to some things. Their apartment was not very far from campus, but as he came in shortly after 1 p.m., an immediate sense of dread overcame him. The front door lock was visibly broken. Something that showed force had been used to gain entry. Stepping inside, Jordan moved cautiously toward the back of the apartment where the bedroom was located. Before he even reached the bedroom, he came across Brittany's body, which lay unresponsive on the floor. Horror gripped him. Instantly, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. He said he saw a lot of blood, and his worst nightmare was that Brittany had been shot. He was instructed by the dispatcher to check if anything was obstructing her airway. Jordan said Brittany felt cold, and when trying to hold her hand, her fingers were rigid. Police arrived on the scene in just minutes. At 1:08 p.m., Jordan was clearly devastated, sobbing uncontrollably, repeating, "She was the nicest person ever. Who would do this?" But in reality, he knew Brittany was pronounced dead at the scene at 1:34 p.m. Jordan had thought she'd been shot, but first responders quickly realized that wasn't the case. The official autopsy would later confirm the details, but it was immediately clear a violent struggle had taken place. Brittany had been stabbed at least once, likely multiple times. Jordan was questioned almost immediately, and within minutes it was very apparent to police that he had nothing to do with the crime. He was asked if anything of value had been taken. He replied he hadn't checked yet, but both their computers remained in plain sight, probably the most valuable items they owned as college students. However, investigators were able to collect a significant amount of evidence. Items seized included Brittany's bloody clothing, a pair of blood-stained women's slippers, a paper towel with an unknown red substance, a sheet of computer paper suspected to bear drops of blood, 18 different blood samples, and 2 sink traps with their contents, collected in hopes that the killer may have attempted to clean the scene before fleeing. In all, investigators collected 23 DNA swabs, 10 fingerprints, and 9 partial footprints from inside the apartment. The volume of evidence suggested this was a case that should have been solvable, but tragically, it would not be so simple. Although nothing seemed to be missing, the initial robbery theory was considered by investigators. There had been a prevalent string of break-ins within the months prior to Brittany's death, many of which had been tied to homeless individuals in the community. Detectives started investigating homeless men in the area who had recent involvement with the law. Throughout the first weeks of the investigation, detectives remained unusually tight-lipped, even to Brittany's family. Meanwhile, autopsy results confirmed the grim reality. Brittany died from complex homicidal violence. She had been stabbed multiple times, strangled, and beaten. Nearly half of those stab wounds were directed right at her heart. Who could do such a thing? Why? And where was the killer now, still at large? As one might have guessed, word of the crime spread through this town in record time, leaving a community shocked and clamoring for answers. Homeless men in the neighborhood were questioned, and soon rumors spread. Had Brittany been too friendly to the homeless? The city was embroiled in a heated controversy. For some residents, Madison had become too lax in its attitude toward the homeless. For others, the city's policies still weren't going far enough. The Capitol basement, for instance, opened its doors every day to offer temporary refuge, and every Sunday, free community meals were served without any questions asked. Opinions varied. Some insisted more rules were called for, while others felt the city's relief programs were being stretched too far. The neighborhood Brittany and Jordan had lived in was noted for homeless people knocking on doors during daylight hours, requesting money or in certain cases coming inside if doors were left unlocked. The police announced unequivocally that repeat offenders within the homeless community were being watched, along with those who had never been in trouble. At first, officials believed Brittany's death was the result of someone from this group coming to her door seeking money. Adding to the unease, just months earlier, a chillingly similar incident had taken place. On January 28th, 31-year-old Joel Marino had been at home, speaking with his grandmother to wish her a happy birthday, when the call was suddenly cut off. Someone had entered his unlocked door and stabbed him to death. Joel suffered 2 stab wounds to the stomach and tried to reach the nearby hospital, but he collapsed in an alley and tragically died before help could arrive. The police investigated extensively, processing over 175 tips, more than 3,000 mugshots, and 200 potential suspects, but nothing came of it. A $30,000 reward was offered for information leading to an arrest, but Joel's murder remained unsolved even by the time Brittany was killed. Within just a few months, 2 murders had taken place, both victims inside their homes, both stabbed to death. Residents questioned if perhaps the community was dealing with a possible serial killer. Investigators shared little information, fueling public fear. People started locking doors and even carrying weapons, struggling with how to feel safe in their own homes. Compounding the tension, the previous summer in 2007, another college student, Kelly Nolan, had disappeared after a night out. Her body was found 16 days later in a wooded area. Investigators believe she had been kidnapped, taken to that location, and killed. By the time of Joel and Brittany's murders, her case remained open and unresolved. To this day, her family still searches for answers. When the community learned of a 911 call Brittany had made either during or just prior to her murder, which was little mentioned in initial reports, doubts were raised about the competence of local law enforcement with 3 unsolved cases in less than a year. Brittany had been on her computer from 12 near to 12:18 p.m., and a minute later at 12:19 p.m., she made that fateful 911 call from her cell phone. The dispatcher was a veteran operator who initially told investigators that nothing could be heard on the line. According to the operator, repeated questions went unanswered, and when the call went dead, she concluded it was accidental. During the first 2 weeks of the investigation, the operator claimed a callback had been made, and that 2 men had answered, insisting they'd called by mistake and didn't need help. It would later emerge that this was entirely false. and whilst a callback had been made, it was to an entirely different number. No callback was ever made to Brittany. The dispatcher never called Brittany back, nor did she send police to investigate, despite the fact that the station was literally just blocks from her apartment. It wasn't until 48 agonizing minutes later that officers finally arrived, and that was only because Jordan had made his desperate call. The subsequent outrage was huge. Brittany's family and friends, the media, and the community were in an uproar. She had taken every precaution she had ever learned since childhood, yet at each turn, she was failed. Nobody checked on her until it was long after the fact. This dispatcher had clearly violated policy by failing to call her back and by not sending an officer to check on her. The dispatcher countered that police only followed up on calls from landlines, not from cell phones, which of course was how Brittany had called in. That distinction struck many as absurd, certainly in 2008. Having to tell the public that police would respond to a landline but not a cell phone call felt jarring and to some, deeply unprofessional. One couldn't shake the haunting thought, if police had been dispatched on that initial call, Brittany might still be alive today, and her killer could have been caught in the act. Instead, she lay in her apartment alone for 48 minutes, no doubt hoping and praying it would arrive. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the ordeal was the apparent attempt to cover up the truth about the call. Authorities refused to release the recording, claiming its release would impede their ongoing investigation. The public's outrage was palpable. The community was expected to accept that the operator had in fact heard nothing and acted in good faith, classifying the call as a routine hang-up or accidental dial. This official narrative drew sharp criticism, particularly from the parents of Joel Marino, who publicly spoke of what they considered negligence in handling both cases. Joel's father told the media, "The county and city are more interested in fighting with each other and protecting egos than solving crimes." In desperation, Joel's mother even sent an email to the state attorney general, begging him to take over the investigation. Eventually, 4 media outlets filed a lawsuit against the county for refusing to release any information about Brittany's 911 call, her fiancé's call, and other related documents. By this point, it was undeniable that inconsistencies existed. Conflicting statements about what had actually been heard during the call had been made repeatedly. It wasn't until a year later, in 2009, that the lawsuit began to progress with the release of all documents in the case, except for the actual recording of Brittany's call. They did release a transcript, though. It painted a frightening picture by including unmistakable signs of a struggle, along with sounds that should have compelled the operator to send in immediate help. The evidence, which had been kept from the public up to now, turned out to be a tape containing noises of a struggle and screaming. Meanwhile, a few months after Brittany's murder, there was finally some hope in the case of Joel Marino. His murderer was in custody. Adam Peterson, a 20-year-old dropout from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, had been tagged as a suspect when police revisited lists of people who had contacted authorities with possible mental health issues. Adam had first called in on January 20th, a week before Joel's murder, to report a stolen laptop. He called in again shortly after Joel's murder, again to report the laptop, and finally a third time after his roommate called in a wellness check on him. Eventually, investigators obtained a warrant for Adam's DNA, which returned a match to the DNA found on the knife used in Joel's murder. Now, the big question remained, who killed Brittany? Detectives announced Adam Peterson had not yet been ruled out as a suspect in her case, but warned media that no direct link between the two murders had been found. The family of Brittany was holding on to hope. They believed this development might bring them closer to finding out who killed her. Investigators continued canvassing the town, speaking with anyone who might have seen something near Brittany's apartment, on the day of the murder or in the days leading up to it. But the neighborhood in which they lived was a very busy area. There was always foot traffic, and many homeless people and transients trekked through, sometimes going from door to door or to whatever location was next. Finding a witness who had actually seen anything relevant was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Authorities did, however, focus on several specific individuals. One of the first was Thomas Cosgrove, a 51-year-old homeless man who lived in the area. Thomas had just recently been arrested for carrying a concealed weapon after he and another homeless man were found sleeping in a campus building. Investigators were so sure he might be involved, they filed 4 separate search warrants: 2 for surveillance footage from a nearby FedEx store he frequented, and 2 for his clothing and personal items. When asked if he knew anything about Brittany's murder and if the crime scene had been disturbed, Thomas gave an eerily strange reply that he wasn't sure if investigators would find his footprints inside the apartment. Detectives found this deeply unsettling. The expected answer to their question would have simply been yes or no. Eventually, despite search warrants and that strange reply, Thomas was cleared and ruled out as a suspect. The next suspect was Jeffrey Ball, a 49-year-old homeless man. On the actual day of Brittany's murder, Jeffrey had been arrested for threatening to stab an employee at Butler Plaza after being found sleeping in a women's bathroom. Not only had he made direct threats, but he had also been found with a bloody knife. Investigators obtained search warrants for his DNA and other evidence, but he too was ultimately cleared. A third suspect, Chanty Mack, 53, was also a possibility. Chanty had been arrested a few weeks after Brittany's death, on May 5, 2008, after assaulting another homeless man. A search warrant was filed for his DNA because witnesses said he bragged about stabbing Brittany. He denied it, and that lead went nowhere. Another name came up a couple of months into the investigation: David Call. Witnesses put him in the vicinity, and like the others, he was also a homeless man with a troubled past. He had a long history of drug use, numerous convictions, and repeated run-ins with the law, including several DUIs. When police interviewed David, he admitted he had been in the neighborhood on the day of Brittany's murder, but said he was only scamming local students, asking for $40 to fix a flat tire that he actually used to buy more drugs. He insisted he had never heard of Brittany and knew nothing about her murder. With only eyewitness accounts placing him nearby, his name, like the others, initially faded to the back burner. Then a particularly promising lead came in December 2008. An inmate at one of the prisons that David had been at recently reported that David had confided in him. He had been concerned that tip from the inmate was chilling. To say David had spoken of his fear that investigators would find his fingerprints around Brittany's throat and on her body. It was a chilling revelation, but at the time, DNA technology wasn't as advanced. Investigators had done everything right. They'd taken the time to collect swabs, fingerprints, and any other material from the scene. Whereas many cases turn cold because essential material is compromised, in this case, they had evidence in plenty, yet nothing matched any DNA in the national database. It was a very cruel, slow wait, and the road ahead for Brittany's family and their relentless pursuit of justice would be very long. The agonizing lack of answers didn't stop in 2008. In 2010, Jordan filed 2 separate lawsuits against the authorities he believed botched Brittany's 911 call. He contended that their negligence had caused him severe emotional distress since finding his fiancée's body. The court unfortunately dismissed his case on the basis that only family members related by blood or marriage can legally file such a suit. Because Jordan didn't qualify in spite of being engaged and planning to wed, he lost the case. In the same year, Brittany's parents, Jean and Kevin, filed 2 separate lawsuits of their own. The first was filed against the owners and management of the apartment building in which Brittany lived, citing building code violations that enabled the killer to break in. The second was filed against the county, asserting that mishandling of Brittany's 911 call directly contributed to her death. Eventually, a settlement with the county was reached. They would pay $55,000 to go toward the reward to find Brittany's killer and $2,500 to go toward her parents' legal fees. All parties were to keep silent in terms of the media. The lawsuit against the apartment building was also settled under the same terms out of court. The years passed with little tangible progress. By 2014, birthdays, holidays, and even the day Brittany and Jordan had planned to be married had all passed without answers. Every milestone felt like a fresh wave of grief, and the family began to worry the case was slowly falling from memory. Then, on December 9, 2014, there was a break. The state crime lab reported a DNA hit. Material taken from Brittany's right shirt sleeve matched a profile of someone investigators had previously looked into: David Call. By then, David was already in prison serving his seventh drunk driving conviction. The DNA match was both hopeful and frustrating. Hopeful because it was their first real lead in years. Frustrating because the match alone wasn't strong enough to bring charges. Investigators knew they would need more evidence if they intended to charge David with Brittany's murder. Detectives also found out on that same day that David had been talking a lot about his crimes while in prison, especially to his cellmate, Andrew Scouse. Much to their surprise, Andrew was willing to inform on David, but only if something was in it for him. 2 days later, detectives made the trek to West Virginia, where Andrew was serving time in federal prison on illegal gun possession. Expectations ran high, but frustration soon set in. Andrew confirmed that David had confessed to killing Brittany, but he refused to provide any details or proof. Investigators were left wondering if Andrew was bluffing. It was the beginning of a long, arduous battle with Andrew to wring from him what he knew. Added to the DNA evidence, it was the first real thread of hope in a cold case that was several years old. With DNA evidence in hand, it wasn't until Andrew could provide the details that investigators realized his testimony might just be the key to arresting David. He would talk about the specifics of Brittany's murder only if both of his felony convictions were expunged. The first conviction was relatively minor, a 2010 marijuana charge, but the second was a federal gun conviction from 2014, which meant expungement would have to involve a presidential pardon. An extraordinarily long and complex process. Justice felt agonizingly close, yet frustratingly out of reach. When Brittany's family heard of this development, their feelings of despair were deep. A glimmer of hope had been rekindled, only to be met again with the same hopeless feeling. Jean went so far as to email Andrew directly in desperation, asking him to cooperate. She appealed to him with the fact that he had a daughter, wondering how he would feel if Brittany was his child. Would he not do everything in his power to see that she got justice? The response from Andrew was shocking. Wholly devoid of empathy, he refused to yield, explaining why he wouldn't help until he got what he wanted. He told Jean that the gun collection, which had led to his federal charge, was central to his life, and that expungement would allow him to reclaim the 29 guns confiscated from him. He declared himself a nobleman. When Jean countered that a nobleman would do the right thing, he replied, "I would be willing to cooperate in any and all ways that I could if the government would give me my life back." It was profoundly heartbreaking, and one could only imagine the crushing weight of helplessness Jean must have felt, knowing the answers to her daughter's murder were literally within reach, but deliberately withheld. By 2015, police communication with Andrew began to fade. He was paroled 2 years later in 2017. Around that time, an unsealed letter from Andrew's attorney to a federal judge surfaced, stating that the attorney had repeatedly tried to schedule interviews with Andrew and investigators, but nothing came of it. The letter also revealed that Andrew was now willing to testify against David for Brittany's murder. It had been nearly 10 years since Brittany's death, yet justice remained elusive. The family couldn't help but ask themselves why there hadn't been an arrest, why there wasn't at least a more defined person of interest, or why a major break hadn't occurred in the case. One of Brittany's parents recalled Chief Cowell visiting their home 2.5 years earlier on her husband's birthday, saying, "We believe we have the person responsible for killing your daughter." That hope was all they had. But realistically, doubt loomed over whether the case would ever be solved, at least not under the way it was being handled. Tragically, Andrew died in a motorcycle accident in August 2017, taking all of his information and secrets with him. By that time, investigators were fairly confident that David Call was the one who had murdered Brittany. He had been in the area that day, and in 2016, he admitted he might have been in Brittany's apartment the day she died, but still denied any involvement in her murder. His DNA, however, had been found on her shirt. His defense claimed any contact was harmless, a handshake or a hug when Brittany had fallen for his scam for $40. He admitted to minor actions, but not the murder. All signs pointed to David, but investigators still needed more. David was set to be paroled from prison on his drunk driving conviction in 2021. a prospect that terrified both Brittany's family and law enforcement. If he suspected authorities were closing in, he could easily go into hiding, perhaps forever. They needed to find a solution while he was still incarcerated, and they needed to do it fast. It was now 2020, and the clock was ticking. By 2020, the pandemic had taken hold, and for many it felt as though the world had ended. For Brittany's family, in truth, the world had felt broken many years earlier. But on March 20th, 2020, a long-awaited moment finally arrived. An arrest was made in Brittany's case. The person taken into custody was indeed David Call. In an unusual announcement, Madison Police Chief Vic Wall shared the news, acknowledging the strange times but stressing the importance of the message. Today's message, when he said, is not about COVID-19 or any public health orders. It's a message I hope will bring closure to our community and justice to a family. On April 2nd, 2008, almost 12 years ago, Brittany Zimmerman was killed in her downtown Madison apartment. Today, I can announce that criminal charges have been filed in her death. David Call, a 53-year-old male, has been charged in Dane County Circuit Court with first-degree intentional homicide as a party to a crime, and with a dangerous weapon. Finally, advances in technology since 2008 had allowed investigators to secure that crucial DNA match from Brittany's shirt, as well as additional DNA from her jeans, matching David's profile unequivocally. As it would turn out, retrospectively, they had possessed the killer's identity all along. But they did have to wait for time to pass, technology to get better, and more definitive evidence to connect him irrevocably to the crime. Eventually, after his arrest, David confessed to everything that had happened that day. He explained to investigators that, on the morning of Brittany's murder, he had gone door to door in search of more money to fuel his drug habit. He was, he said himself, already extremely high. Again, he told people he needed $40 to fix a flat tire. Most of them turned him down. He entered one woman's home while she had left her door unlocked. But when she asked him to leave, he did so without incident or altercation. One can only imagine the terror with which she narrowly escaped that day. After tracing the city for a few hours without success, David came across Brittany's apartment building. He decided to break in, hoping that since the door was locked, no one would be home. Tragically, he was wrong. Brittany was there. At first, David said things had not escalated. He said he had no intention of hurting Brittany. He just wanted money. When she told him she had none, he intended to leave, just as he had done at the other woman's home. But then he asked if he could use the bathroom. Some might suggest Brittany's kindness led her to agree. Others could argue she was buying herself a moment to think, to plan an escape, or to seek help. She was, after all, intelligent and extremely safety conscious. Tragically, when David came out of the bathroom, he saw Brittany on her cell phone, presumably calling 911. That was when he snapped, he said. Brittany was trying to call for help, and David was not going to go back to jail for breaking in. In one violent second, he grabbed her from behind, knocking the phone from her hand onto the floor. This explained why the dispatcher had heard nothing. Brittany had been fighting for her life, unable to speak. She had done everything right, yet no one came to help her. David then dragged her into the bedroom, threw her onto the bed, grabbed a nearby t-shirt, and began strangling her. At this point, Brittany would most likely have lost consciousness. David noted that she was no longer moving. However, David noticed that Brittany was still breathing, which led to the next horrific step: going into the kitchen to retrieve a knife from the butcher's block and proceeding to stab her to make sure she really would be dead. By the time he left, it was remembered that Jordan had found Brittany's body while walking toward the bedroom, indicating she was either in the doorway or in the hallway. David's confession said he had left her on the bed, which begged the haunting question of whether Brittany could have regained consciousness after he had left, struggling with her last vestiges of strength to reach a phone or escape. The thought was devastating to within, knowing full well that if law enforcement had been dispatched sooner, she may have had a chance. David had pleaded not guilty, with his trial scheduled for January 2023. However, after what his attorney described as a period of deep soul-searching, he finally chose to plead guilty as part of a plea deal. The agreement was that if he pleaded guilty, the state would not object to a petition for extended supervision once he had served 20 years of his sentence. David and his attorneys accepted the deal, especially because by then he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. They even asked that he be sentenced to life as quickly as possible so he could be moved to a facility equipped to treat his mental condition. The diagnosis did not impact his sentencing or conviction because a judge had previously ruled him competent. David said, "I would like to apologize to everybody, especially the Zimmerman family. I took away Brittany's 21-year-old life." The case remained profoundly mind-blowing. It was staggering that it had taken so many years to find Brittany's killer. Without the DNA linking him to the crime, David could have been released from prison and very easily evaded justice, taking Brittany's story with him. The catastrophic mishandling of the 911 call remained a terrifying thought, a failure directly contributing to her death. It was also remembered that college student Kelly Nolan had been murdered the previous summer. David never confessed to her murder, and no evidence ever connected him to that case. Her family continues their search for answers to this day. Brittany would by now have been a doctor. Her family had little doubt that by this time, she would have married and had children to fill her house. And cats, her favorite pets. During the pandemic, her mother mused, Brittany would have been a huge asset and support, as COVID-19 was just the kind of virus she wanted to find a cure for. One image remained most vivid. That of a girl who was someone's daughter, who had her whole life still ahead of her. Photos captured some of the last glimpses of her, including one from the day she was born and another with her younger brother, Matthew. One thought clung closer than any other, that final call Brittany made to her mom. Shortly before it all went down, Jean could only imagine the agony of knowing her daughter likely died just 30 minutes after trying to reach her mom. Maybe they would have chatted for a few minutes. Maybe the outcome would have been the same. Maybe nothing could have changed what happened that day. Yet it was heart-wrenching to know that call had been missed. It is a strong reminder to reach out to loved ones, to tell them just how much they are appreciated. Again, as hackneyed as it sounds, it is just that true. No one knows when someone will be taken, or when their time will be up. That morning, Brittany had been happy, full of life, stressing about things that, in the end, would mean absolutely nothing. Within mere hours, she was gone. It was unnerving to consider the chain of events that placed her in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps if she had studied with her friend at the campus library, or attended a noon class, or gone out for lunch, she and Jordan would have been out of the apartment safe and alive. Although it was far too late, her family could take some solace in knowing justice had caught up with her killer, and he will never walk the streets again, never hurt another person, the way he had hurt their family on that day in April. Thank you for your presence and for listening. Please do not forget to ring the bell for our latest stories, and please take care and enjoy the time with your loved ones.